The night settles over Moscow like a slow exhale, cold, silver, and impossibly still. Somewhere in the maze of the city's luxury high-rises and dimly lit cafes, a man once known as Alimzhan Tokhtakhounov lingers in the imagination of those who whisper about the underworld. To most, his name is just an echo, a shadow mentioned in passing between diplomats, gamblers, and old gangsters nursing their final drinks. Yet for those who truly knew, or thought they did, he was something else entirely. A phantom. A fixer. A man who could make the impossible quietly rearrange itself with a single phone call. He was the ghost of the post-Soviet world, the bridge between old loyalty and new corruption. When the empire of the USSR collapsed, most men were either swallowed by chaos or reborn as predators. Tokhtakhounov was neither. He didn't shout, didn't threaten, didn't even seem to try. He floated between circles of wealth and power with the calm detachment of someone who understood that fear was unnecessary when you controlled access. To many, he seemed like smoke, visible, tangible for a second, then gone before you could close your hand around him. Imagine him sitting in a velvet chair in a Monte Carlo casino, expression unreadable, cigarette burning slowly as laughter swirls around him. The eyes of billionaires and ex-spies flicker in his direction, not out of recognition, but out of instinct. They feel that he matters, even if they can't say why. Somewhere, a deal shifts direction. Somewhere else, a call is made. It is said that when Alimzhan Tokhtakhounov moved, things happened. Money flowed differently. Favors changed hands. Matches were won or lost not by skill, but by invisible persuasion. And yet, ask any lawman or journalist for the full truth about him, and they'll hesitate. They'll tell you that he's accused of fixing Olympic events, of laundering money, of weaving webs that stretch from Moscow to Paris to Beverly Hills. But then they'll admit that nothing ever really stuck. He was investigated, hunted, even arrested once, but never convicted. Every charge slipped away like rain on glass. Every pursuit ended in frustration. That is why they began calling him the man who was never there. To understand Tokhtakhounov is to understand the idea of power without presence. He didn't need an empire of soldiers or a display of violence. His currency was access, to politicians, celebrities, athletes, and businessmen. He was fluent in charm, in timing, in the subtle art of making others believe that helping him was helping themselves. In the 1980s and 1990s, when Russia's future was for sale, he didn't grab it. He negotiated with it. And the strange thing was, he always seemed to win. His legend grew because no one could quite define him. To some, he was a sports promoter, a cultural ambassador, a businessman. To others, a criminal mastermind who controlled outcomes without ever lifting a finger. In truth, perhaps he was both, a mirror reflecting whatever those around him needed to see. The fixer who could find you a visa, a sponsor, or a loophole in fate itself. The phantom whose presence was known not by his face, but by what moved in his wake. It's easy to see why his story feels almost cinematic. He lived through the end of one empire and the birth of another, not as a spectator, but as a quiet conductor behind the curtain. He walked among presidents, models, gamblers, and gangsters, yet never seemed to belong entirely to any world. His life was a paradox, opulent yet invisible, dangerous yet peaceful, public yet untouchable. Tonight, as we begin this story, imagine yourself drifting through that world. Picture the low hum of Moscow traffic, the distant echo of laughter in a private club, the weight of secrets in the air. The story you are about to hear is not just about crime or conspiracy, it's about illusion, how one man built a legend out of silence. In the coming chapters, we'll trace his path from the dust of Tashkent to the glitter of Monte Carlo, from whispered deals to public scandals. We'll follow the rise of a man who learned that to survive, one must never be fully seen. But for now, as the night deepens and the world slows to a hush, just remember his name, Alimzhan Tokhtakhounov, the Russian fixer who lived like a phantom. Because what happens next might just explain how a man can shape the world and still leave behind nothing but smoke. The year was 1949, in the heart of Soviet Uzbekistan, a land of warm winds, golden deserts, and quiet resilience. Amidst the fading songs of traders in the old markets of Tashkent, a boy named Alimzhan Tokhtakhounov was born into a world that demanded strength wrapped in silence. His childhood was not extraordinary in appearance: modest homes, crowded streets, the smell of dust and bread, but even then, there was something different about him. He was calm when others shouted, patient when others panicked. People said that the boy had old eyes, as if he could already see through the illusions of life that others spent decades trying to understand. Growing up in the Uzbek Soviet Socialist Republic meant living under layers of identity, part Asian, part Soviet, always being measured against the ideals of Moscow. For young Alimzhan, that meant knowing where to blend in and when to stand out. He learned early that survival wasn't just about strength, but about reading the air, understanding moods, timing, and what people needed to hear before they said it themselves. It was this quiet intuition that would one day make him indispensable to powerful men, but in those early years, it was simply his way of surviving. Tashkent in the 1950s was rebuilding, modernizing after the war, yet behind the parades and propaganda lay deep scarcity. The Soviet system promised equality but delivered shortage of food, of opportunity, of trust. Even as a teenager, Tokhtakhounov noticed that those who truly thrived were not the loudest patriots, but the clever ones who knew how to find what others couldn't. Cigarettes from Moscow, imported jeans from Poland, a foreign record that only a few hands had touched, these were treasures that turned ordinary boys into local legends. He began to see how value wasn't in the thing itself, but in access. Sports became his early escape. Tokhtakhounov had a love for football, not just for the game but for the social world around it. In the Soviet Union, athletes were treated like unofficial ambassadors, adored, admired, but also connected. Games brought together players, coaches, journalists, and bureaucrats, creating a rare space where influence flowed more freely than politics. As a young man, he played with passion, but more importantly, he observed. He saw how charm could open doors that strength could not. He realized that being liked was more powerful than being feared. When he moved to Moscow as a young adult, it was not out of rebellion but ambition. He wanted to be part of the center, the city that decided who mattered. The Moscow of the 1960s and 70s was both intimidating and seductive. Wide boulevards lined with propaganda posters, secret police watching from corners, and yet beneath the rigidity, there was life, the underground exchange of music, ideas, and Western luxuries. For someone with Tokhtakhounov's instincts, it was a world waiting to be read like a map. He quickly discovered that life in Moscow demanded a different skill set. You couldn't rely on strength or connections from home. You needed to adapt, to blend, to sense opportunity before it was visible. He worked, he watched, he listened. His social grace made him popular among both the athletic and artistic circles, communities that mixed state privilege with quiet rebellion. He was not rich, but he was never excluded. He didn't brag, didn't impose. He was simply there, remembered by everyone, trusted by most. Those who met him in those days described him as intelligent, stylish, almost Western in his demeanor. He wore good suits even when money was tight, spoke softly but confidently, and had a way of turning small talk into quiet negotiation. By the late 1970s, he had become what one might call a cultural insider. He understood the language of influence, the unspoken trade of favors that thrived beneath Soviet bureaucracy. In a system where everyone needed something and nothing was ever officially available, such understanding was priceless. But what truly separated him was his detachment. He never seemed desperate for approval. While others fought for scraps of power, Tokhtakhounov behaved as if he already had it. That calm self-assurance made people curious, even those far above his station. A well-placed favor here, a discreet introduction there, and soon his name was circulating quietly among people who mattered. They didn't know exactly what he did, but they knew that if something needed to happen, he might be able to help. Behind that growing network was a philosophy shaped by his early years in Uzbekistan. He had learned that being underestimated was an advantage. While many from his region struggled against prejudice in Moscow, Tokhtakhounov turned it into armor. He never tried to outshine the Russians, instead, he outlasted them. He became a master of patience, the kind of man who could wait years for the right moment, then act in silence and precision. By the early 1980s, Moscow was changing, and so was he. The cracks in the Soviet system were widening, and the economy was beginning to bleed. Shortages grew, corruption spread quietly through the halls of power, and a new kind of man began to emerge, one who could navigate both worlds, official and underground. Tokhtakhounov was perfectly positioned for that transformation. He was not a criminal yet, not even close. But he was beginning to understand how influence worked, how it could be traded, hidden, and multiplied. In those years, as the cold Moscow winters fell heavy on the city, Tokhtakhounov's apartment would become a quiet hub for friends, athletes, and minor officials, a place where deals were discussed, where loyalty was tested over tea and vodka. Those evenings, filled with laughter and unspoken truths, were the true classrooms of his education. He was learning not from books, but from the rhythm of human desire. What no one realized then was that this young man from the steppe, polite and invisible, would one day grow into one of the most enigmatic figures in modern organized crime. The boy who learned to adapt in a city that didn't trust outsiders would one day be trusted by billionaires and feared by nations. But that would come later. For now, the seeds of his transformation had been planted, in the dust of Tashkent, in the charm of football fields, in the unspoken deals of Moscow cafes. The fixer was not yet born, but the foundation of the phantom had already begun to take shape. By the time the 1970s began to fade into the 1980s, Moscow had become a city of contradictions, a capital of power built on scarcity, an empire of slogans hiding an underworld of quiet deals. Beneath the marble facades of the Kremlin and the gray apartment blocks of ordinary citizens, a second economy thrived, a black market network that kept the Soviet Union breathing when its official system could not. It was here, in this hidden marketplace of needs and whispers, that Alimzhan Tokhtakhounov began to truly understand the art of survival. The Soviet black market, known as the Tenovaya Ekonomika, the shadow economy, was not just about crime, it was about necessity. Ordinary citizens bartered, traded, and smuggled whatever they could to get the things the government failed to provide. Western jeans, foreign cigarettes, French perfume, small luxuries that carried enormous social value. It was in this environment that Tokhtakhounov found his natural place. He was not a thug, not a thief, but a connector. He knew who had what, who wanted what, and who could make introductions quietly. At first, it was harmless, helping friends get goods, arranging small trades, easing the frustrations of bureaucratic red tape. But soon, this simple skill began to attract attention. Moscow was full of people with power, but few with influence. Tokhtakhounov, with his charm and precision, began to bridge that gap. If an athlete needed a car that couldn't be bought through official channels, Tokhtakhounov knew someone who could help. If an actor wanted Western clothes for a film shoot, he could arrange it discreetly. In a society where every favor required another favor, he was becoming indispensable. Money flowed through these networks, but more valuable than cash was reputation. Those who dealt with him said the same thing: he was calm, fair, reliable. He delivered what he promised, and never bragged. In a world of hustlers and opportunists, that made him unique. He didn't cheat or threaten, he negotiated. He was the kind of man you called when something delicate needed to be done without attention. And in a state built on surveillance and suspicion, such talent was priceless. By the early 1980s, he was deeply connected to figures in sports and entertainment, the few professions that offered glimpses of the world beyond the Iron Curtain. Soviet athletes traveled abroad, and when they returned, they often brought things that couldn't be officially sold: electronics, designer clothes, even foreign currency. Tokhtakhounov became the quiet link between these worlds, moving items, favors, and sometimes even information. He learned how to navigate customs officials, border agents, and bureaucrats not through bribes or threats, but through the subtler art of reciprocity. Everyone got something. Everyone owed something. There were others in the same game, but few were as careful. The Soviet black market could be ruthless, mistakes often ended in arrest or exile. Yet, Tokhtakhounov seemed immune. He avoided excess, never flaunted wealth, and built friendships in places where others made enemies. The police knew his name but rarely interfered. It wasn't that he was untouchable yet, it was that he never gave them a reason to act. His crimes, if one could call them that, were woven so naturally into the system's contradictions that to expose him would be to expose the system itself. As the Soviet Union began to decay, the underworld grew stronger. The late 1980s were a strange, uncertain time, a period of reform and confusion under Gorbachev's perestroika. Official structures loosened, and opportunities multiplied for those bold enough to take them. For the first time, private business was tolerated, and the boundaries between legal and illegal blurred. For Tokhtakhounov, this was evolution, not revolution. What he had been doing quietly for years was now simply becoming mainstream. He didn't need to change, the world was catching up to him. Still, beneath the surface of his calm exterior, he was watching carefully. He saw how greed and chaos consumed those who moved too fast. Men who had been small-time traders suddenly tried to become kings overnight, and vanished just as quickly. He learned that the only lasting power was invisible power. While others built empires with guns and threats, he built networks, of trust, obligation, and information. His influence grew not because he shouted louder, but because he whispered less. Those who encountered him during this period often left with conflicting impressions. Some thought he was a businessman, others suspected he was a smuggler or an agent of some kind. He never confirmed nor denied anything. His life was a balance between mystery and credibility, and he maintained it with a craftsman's care. In a system that punished ambition and rewarded conformity, he became an enigma, successful without visible means, respected without title, feared without crime. And yet, the underworld was evolving. The Soviet criminal culture, the Vori v Zakon, the thieves-in-law, were powerful and feared, but even they began to change. The old codes of honor and silence were breaking down, and new alliances were being formed between gangsters and businessmen. It was during this transition that Tokhtakhounov began to step closer to figures who operated outside the law but within influence. He was not one of them, but he was near enough to be useful. His knowledge of connections, logistics, and negotiation made him a valuable intermediary, a fixer, in the truest sense. By the late 1980s, he had established a reputation as someone who could arrange things that others could not. Visas, transfers, business permissions, all of it required navigation through an ocean of Soviet bureaucracy, and he knew every current. Even state officials began to rely on men like him to move resources efficiently. He had become a man between worlds, not a criminal, not a politician, but a translator of systems. In many ways, Tokhtakhounov's early ventures were the training ground for what he would become later, a global manipulator of outcomes, a phantom who operated above borders and beneath notice. These years taught him how to hide in plain sight, how to turn favors into leverage, and how to make loyalty more valuable than fear. By the time the Soviet Union finally crumbled in 1991, he had already mastered the art of survival in chaos. Where others saw collapse, he saw clarity. The rules had changed, but the game remained the same, and he was already 10 moves ahead. The man from Tashkent who once traded jeans and cigarettes in the alleys of Moscow had evolved into something entirely different, a quiet architect of influence, ready to step into a world that no longer had walls. The shadows he had learned to navigate were now stretching across borders, and soon, they would carry his name far beyond the Soviet Union. Moscow in the early 1990s was a city reborn and broken at the same time, a place where old power had collapsed and new fortunes were being built from smoke. The Soviet Union had dissolved, and the rigid structures that once kept everything in line were gone. Streets that once echoed with military parades were now crowded with luxury cars, foreign businessmen, and men in leather jackets with too much money and too few rules. It was in this chaos of ambition and opportunity that Alimzhan Tokhtakhounov began to rise above the rest, not through violence or greed, but through grace, intelligence, and the careful art of knowing everyone who mattered. He was no longer the quiet trader of his younger years. By now, Tokhtakhounov had evolved into something entirely new, a man who belonged everywhere yet was owned by no one. While other figures from the Soviet underworld tried to legitimize themselves with nightclubs and flashy cars, he moved differently. His charm, his sophistication, and his almost uncanny ability to connect people made him welcome in circles far beyond the reach of traditional gangsters. The streets whispered his name, but so did the salons of Moscow's elite. He wasn't feared like a mobster, he was admired like a mystery. The city's nightclubs became his stage. In dimly lit lounges filled with cigarette smoke, jazz music, and the laughter of new money, Tokhtakhounov moved like a man at peace with chaos. He dressed elegantly, spoke softly, and carried himself with a calm that disarmed even the most suspicious men. He wasn't there to impress, he was there to observe. People gravitated toward him, actors, athletes, singers, politicians, and ex-KGB men who now called themselves businessmen. To them, Tokhtakhounov was not a criminal but a connector, a man who could solve problems with a phone call and no trace. He became known for his generosity, discreet but never forgotten. A gift sent at the right moment, a favor returned without being asked. To those within Moscow's entertainment world, he was a patron of sorts. He attended film premieres, hosted dinners, and invested quietly in artistic ventures that blended luxury with influence. He didn't need to buy status, he cultivated it through elegance and trust. His home became a meeting point for the powerful and the ambitious, a sanctuary where deals were whispered. Alliances were formed, and secrets were exchanged. Among his closest circles were famous athletes and pop icons. Sports had always been part of his identity, and now it became part of his influence. He sponsored events, supported players, and arranged introductions between businessmen and stars. Through these relationships, he gained access to worlds few men could touch, the hidden network of sports betting, international tournaments, and celebrity endorsements that connected Moscow to Monaco, Paris, and New York. What fascinated many was his ability to balance these dual worlds, the glamorous and the dangerous. He could sit beside a famous actress one evening and meet a former intelligence officer the next morning. Everyone trusted him because he never pretended to be what he wasn't. He had no illusions of grandeur, no hunger for fame. He preferred to remain in the background, the quiet presence behind conversations that changed fortunes. But beneath the glamour, there was something more profound at work, a transformation of power itself. The underworld was evolving, moving away from brute force toward influence and access. In that shift, Tokhtakhounov became indispensable. He understood that real control came not from ownership but from the ability to facilitate. While others were buying assets, he was building relationships. While others flaunted wealth, he traded in trust. He was becoming the archetype of a new kind of figure in post-Soviet Russia, the gentleman gangster. The Western press would later call him Taiwanchik, a nickname that stuck because of his Asian features and the sense of exoticism it carried in Moscow. But among those who truly knew him, he was simply Alec, approachable, polite, and unfailingly composed. His demeanor never changed, even as his name began to circulate in rumors of billion-dollar deals and international gambling networks. Those close to him said he had an almost meditative calm, the stillness of someone who understood that chaos could be turned into currency. The nightlife of Moscow became a microcosm of the new Russia, wealth without restraint, loyalty without guarantees, and power that shifted hands as easily as a glass of champagne. Yet in all that noise, Tokhtakhounov remained a whisper. When others sought headlines, he sought discretion. When others demanded loyalty through fear, he earned it through respect. His secret was simple: he made people feel seen, valued, and understood. And in a world ruled by vanity and mistrust, that was the most intoxicating power of all. It was around this time that Western celebrities and businessmen began to appear in Moscow, drawn by opportunity and novelty. Through mutual acquaintances, some crossed paths with Tokhtakhounov. He became known as a man who could arrange anything: a visa, an introduction, a private meeting, a quiet favor. He moved fluidly between worlds that didn't normally touch, creating invisible bridges where others built walls. To Westerners, he embodied the charm of the New Russia, sophisticated, worldly, and unpredictable. To Russians, he was proof that one could rise without betraying elegance or identity. Of course, whispers of his darker dealings began to surface too. It was said that he had ties to gambling operations, that he could fix matches, that his reach extended into the hidden layers of international sports. Whether those claims were true or simply legends born from his reputation didn't matter. What mattered was that people believed them. And in his world, belief was power. Yet, for all the speculation, Tokhtakhounov seemed untouched by scandal. He laughed it off, entertained questions with charm, and moved on before curiosity turned to suspicion. He understood that attention was a double-edged sword, and he wielded it masterfully. For every rumor that surfaced, there was a new photo of him attending a cultural event, shaking hands with respected figures, smiling like a man with nothing to hide. The line between legality and illegality in post-Soviet Russia was as thin as cigarette smoke. Everyone in power had shadows behind them, and Tokhtakhounov simply learned to live within that ambiguity better than most. His public persona, stylish, sociable, generous, gave him cover to move through dangerous waters without leaving a trace. By the mid-1990s, his transformation was complete. He was no longer a participant in the underworld, he was a curator of it. He wasn't the one making the deals, he was the one ensuring they happened smoothly. And as his connections deepened, his legend grew. The fixer who never raised his voice, the phantom who could be seen but never cornered, the man whose presence meant that something was quietly being resolved. Moscow's nights were changing. The music was louder, the money was dirtier, and the stakes were higher. Yet, amid that glittering chaos, one man remained untouched by the noise, smiling, watching, always one step ahead. For the first time, the world was beginning to notice the name Alimzhan Tokhtakhounov, though few could say with certainty who he really was. The collapse of the Soviet Union did not just dissolve a country, it dismantled an entire way of life. Out of the ruins of ideology rose a new empire built on wealth, greed, and survival. The 1990s in Russia were not a transition but a transformation, a storm of privatization, corruption, and reinvention. One day, factories belonged to the people, the next, they were sold for scraps to men who became billionaires overnight. Moscow turned into a theater of power, where money replaced ideology and new kings were crowned not in marble halls, but in dim restaurants guarded by men in leather coats. It was in this shifting, ruthless world that Alimzhan Tokhtakhounov, the man once known for his charm and discretion, found his place among the new oligarchs. They called them the New Russians. They were brash, loud, and hungry, men who had grown up in the grey world of socialism and suddenly found themselves in possession of unimaginable wealth. Oil fields, television networks, factories, and sports clubs, everything was for sale, and everything had a price. Most of these men had risen too fast to understand restraint. They surrounded themselves with bodyguards, mistresses, and luxury, burning through fortunes as quickly as they made them. But in this chaotic new nobility, there were a few who understood that survival would require more than money. They would need someone who could navigate the invisible lines between power and danger. Someone like Alimzhan Tokhtakhounov. He did not own companies or control factories. He didn't need to. His value came from his influence, his ability to bring people together, to resolve disputes before they turned violent, to make introductions that changed lives and balances of power. Where others saw a risk, he saw opportunity. While the oligarchs competed for assets, Tokhtakhounov built connections, becoming the man you called when even the most powerful needed help. By this time, his nickname, Taiwanchik, had become well known in Moscow's elite circles. It was meant affectionately, a reflection of his distinctive features, but over time it became a brand, a name that carried weight in whispered conversations. It symbolized both distance and familiarity, the paradox of a man who could blend into any crowd yet was known everywhere. His presence was never announced, he simply appeared, calm and unhurried, at the places where decisions were made and futures decided. The post-Soviet elite lived dangerously, not just in wealth but in politics. Alliances shifted overnight, and enemies were made over a single misstep. Yet Tokhtakhounov managed to exist within this volatile atmosphere without making enemies of his own. He never picked sides, he offered balance. When oligarchs quarreled, he mediated quietly. When partnerships soured, he found new arrangements. It was said that he could sit across from two rivals and make both believe he was on their side, not through deceit, but through understanding. His skill was in reading people. He knew when pride was disguising fear, when confidence hid desperation. In the 1990s, when men carried guns in their briefcases and fortunes were decided over vodka at midnight, such insight was more valuable than gold. Unlike most power brokers, Tokhtakhounov did not use intimidation. He used timing. A phone call delayed, a meeting arranged, a word passed at the right moment, these small gestures had consequences that shaped millions of dollars and, sometimes, the lives of those who dared to chase them. His connections extended beyond Moscow. He became a familiar face in Paris, Monte Carlo, and Berlin, always appearing at the elegant edges of events where business, politics, and pleasure intersected. Casinos, fashion shows, charity galas, these were his new arenas. The line between high society and organized crime blurred easily in those years, and Tokhtakhounov moved along it with the grace of a man walking a tightrope above chaos. But the most striking thing about him was his restraint. In an era where new wealth was measured by ostentation, gold watches, foreign cars, imported cigars, Tokhtakhounov remained subtle. He lived well, but never flaunted excess. He understood that attention was a risk, that mystery was protection. The oligarchs surrounded themselves with guards, Tokhtakhounov surrounded himself with silence. Behind that silence, however, lay a growing legend. People began to believe that he had the power to settle disputes between billionaires and government officials. Some whispered that he was connected to global gambling networks, that his influence stretched into sports and entertainment across Europe. Others said he had ties to old Soviet intelligence figures who had reinvented themselves as consultants. None of it could be proven, yet every rumor added another layer to his myth. For those who saw him up close, the most striking quality was composure. He never seemed rushed, never appeared anxious. Even in rooms filled with tension, he projected calm, a calm that made others lower their guard. That composure became his weapon. It was said that when negotiations reached a breaking point, he would simply light a cigarette, sit back, and say softly, "Let's find a solution." And somehow, there always was one. Tokhtakhounov was not a gangster in the traditional sense. He did not command soldiers or territories. His power was relational, it flowed through networks of trust and mutual interest. If he was dangerous, it was because he understood leverage better than anyone else. He knew that in post-Soviet Russia, money came and went, but relationships, the right ones, could last forever. The 1990s were violent years for those who sought too much control. Mafia wars erupted in the streets, assassinations became common, and oligarchs who crossed the wrong people often disappeared. Yet Tokhtakhounov's name was never tied to violence. He operated like a diplomat in a world of bandits, relying on persuasion rather than intimidation. He understood that in chaos, survival depended on being useful, and he was useful to everyone. By the mid-1990s, he had become something of a legend not just in Russia but abroad. In the luxurious corners of Monte Carlo and the Riviera, his name was spoken with a mixture of curiosity and respect. He was known as a fixer, someone who could arrange anything, from introductions to solutions for complex legal or financial entanglements. He didn't need to advertise his services, his reputation traveled faster than any headline. It was around this time that Western intelligence agencies began to notice him. His connections, his movement across borders, his links to influential Russians and Europeans, all of it painted the outline of a man who operated in a space few could reach. He was not a criminal mastermind in the cinematic sense, but something more elusive, a man who understood systems, political, economic, and human, and knew how to make them bend quietly in his favor. While many of his contemporaries burned brightly and fell quickly, Tokhtakhounov endured. He avoided the pitfalls of ego that destroyed others. He didn't crave headlines or power displays, he preferred invisibility wrapped in refinement. He learned that survival was not about control, but about adaptability. Like smoke, he flowed around obstacles rather than breaking through them. By the end of the decade, the old Soviet dream was long gone, replaced by an empire of private jets, offshore accounts, and men who ruled through influence rather than ideology. And somewhere in the quiet corners of that empire, often seen but never cornered, sat Alimzhan Tokhtakhounov, sipping his drink, listening, and smiling slightly as the new kings built their fragile thrones. He was not one of them, but they all knew his name. In a world of billionaires and gunmen, he was the rarest kind of power, the kind that did not need to prove itself. The phantom among oligarchs, the man who could make peace between predators, and the living embodiment of Russia's new creed, money fades, but mystery endures. He had learned, long before others understood, that the surest way to survive power was to be invisible within it. While Moscow's newly rich paraded themselves in fur coats and foreign cars, Alimzhan Tokhtakhounov perfected the art of vanishing in plain sight. He lived in luxury but not spectacle, always 1 degree removed from attention. Those who saw him at banquets or in photographs thought him refined, calm, almost detached, as if he were merely a guest in a play that everyone else was taking too seriously. Yet behind that calm exterior was precision, a discipline honed over years of watching men destroy themselves by being too visible. To disappear was not to hide, it was to blend. In the world he navigated, danger came not from obscurity, but from exposure. The more a man flaunted his fortune, the more enemies he attracted. For Tokhtakhounov, invisibility was strategy, a constant balancing act between presence and distance. He knew exactly when to appear, when to withdraw, and when to let others speak in his place. His absence at key moments was often more meaningful than any public gesture. His residences reflected this philosophy. In Moscow, his apartment was elegant but modest, tucked within a guarded building that blended seamlessly into its neighborhood. There were no gold-plated gates, no fleet of cars parked outside. Inside, it was all refinement, art pieces, muted tones, fine fabrics, and the faint smell of expensive tobacco. Visitors often described it as peaceful, almost monastic. He entertained selectively, never allowing crowds, always maintaining a sense of quiet exclusivity. To be invited into his space was both an honor and a test. In Europe, he lived the same way. Monte Carlo, Paris, and later, the Côte d'Azur, each home chosen not for show, but for privacy. He understood that the true elite valued discretion above extravagance. He dined at quiet restaurants, frequented private casinos, and was often seen in conversation rather than celebration. To outsiders, he appeared as an aging gentleman with refined taste, perhaps a businessman, perhaps a retired diplomat. Only those who knew his story recognized the calm gravity behind the smile. It was during these years that his aura of mystery deepened. The newspapers began to mention his name occasionally, not in stories of violence or crime, but in footnotes about businessmen of influence. His face would appear briefly in photographs beside models, athletes, or old friends from Moscow's upper circles. But there was never a headline, never a scandal directly linked to him. When questions arose, he was always elsewhere, unreachable, a step beyond the reach of curiosity. That ability to disappear when needed became his shield. Law enforcement in several countries began to take interest in Russia's export of corruption and organized influence. Yet every investigation that seemed to point his way fell apart upon closer inspection. He used no traceable emails. No obvious shell companies, no public paper trail. Transactions flowed through layers of intermediaries, legal fronts, and unwritten understandings. What little evidence ever surfaced led nowhere. Those who tried to follow his path through banks and borders found only dead ends, as if the man himself had been erased from the map. His relationships were his true defense. He had cultivated a network of loyalty that transcended nationality. Friends in politics, business, entertainment, and sport, each owed him something, or at least respected the quiet way he operated. They called him for advice, introductions, and mediation. In turn, he gained protection, not through bribery or coercion, but through usefulness. As long as he was valuable, he was safe. Tokhtakhounov's invisibility was not born from fear but from philosophy. He believed that power revealed was power lost. He once told a friend, "A man who shows everything has already given away his strength." He preferred whispers over announcements, shadows over spotlights. His presence was felt rather than seen, a name spoken softly in expensive rooms, a quiet nod from someone who knew the balance of favors that bound half the elite together. But invisibility also required discipline. He lived by routine, cautious with technology, wary of betrayal. He changed phone numbers often, used different cars for different cities, and never allowed his schedule to become predictable. Even his public appearances seemed choreographed, arriving at the last minute, leaving before photographs could circulate. His life became a series of controlled illusions. The fewer facts people had about him, the more myth filled the gaps. In Moscow's criminal and business circles, stories about him took on a life of their own. Some claimed he had direct ties to high-ranking officials, others swore he could fix disputes with a single phone call. There were rumors that he mediated between rival criminal factions without ever leaving his apartment, that he resolved multimillion-dollar conflicts over a cup of tea. None of it was proven, but no one dared dismiss it. Myth had become his second skin, and he wore it effortlessly. Still, there was a cost to such existence. To live unseen is to live alone. Those close to him noticed that he grew quieter over the years, less social, more introspective. He spent long evenings listening to classical music, smoking in silence by his balcony. The phone still rang with requests, but fewer people stayed to talk. The price of invisibility, as he well knew, was detachment. To remain untouchable, one must also remain unreachable. In those moments of solitude, he seemed at peace, even as the world around him grew louder. Moscow had become a city of glass towers and black SUVs, its wealth sharper and colder than ever. The brashness of the new elite no longer amused him. He had seen too many men rise and fall to believe in permanence. He preferred the company of those who valued silence, old musicians, retired athletes, quiet intellectuals who shared his nostalgia for a world that once had rhythm instead of noise. Even as his life stretched across continents, he retained his simplicity of manner. When journalists tried to interview him, he was courteous but elusive. He would answer questions with humor, deflecting anything too direct. He never denied the rumors, he simply made them sound unnecessary. When asked about his reputation as a fixer, he smiled and said, "People always exaggerate. I'm just good at keeping friends." But his modesty fooled no one who truly understood influence. By the late 1990s, Alimzhan Tokhtakhounov had become one of the most connected men in Russia's shadow elite, and yet, officially, he owned little and controlled nothing. He had achieved something rare, a form of invisible power that existed entirely through perception. The less he appeared to do, the more others believed he could do anything. Invisibility had become his empire. No territory, no titles, just networks and silence. Where other men sought legacy, he sought absence. To him, being remembered for what one might have done was safer than being known for what one had done. As the millennium approached, he stood at the height of his invisible influence. Moscow buzzed with ambition, and the West was opening its doors to Russian money. He could have chosen fame or fortune, but instead, he chose to remain the phantom, the man who existed in the spaces between truth and rumor. For Tokhtakhounov, disappearance was not defeat. It was mastery. He had learned how to be seen by everyone yet known by no one, how to stand in a crowded room and leave no trace behind. It was not magic, it was method. The art of invisibility perfected by a man who understood that in a world built on chaos, the quietest figure always lasts the longest. By the time the new millennium dawned, Alimzhan Tokhtakhounov had long transcended Moscow's restless energy. The city that once forged him had become a noisy battlefield of oligarchs, politicians, and gangsters clawing for visibility, each one desperate to prove their dominance in the wild theater of post-Soviet capitalism. But Tokhtakhounov had already moved on to a different stage, one far more refined and elusive. His new world was lit not by the neon glow of Moscow's nightlife but by the soft lights of the French Riviera, the quiet elegance of Monte Carlo, and the distant hum of casinos where fortunes whispered instead of shouted. Monte Carlo, the city of charm and disguise, where kings gambled with businessmen and spies smiled behind champagne flutes, suited him perfectly. To most who saw him there, he was simply another dignified gentleman of means, a man who enjoyed art, conversation, and fine living. His days passed between lunches overlooking the Mediterranean and evenings at exclusive tables where the rules were unspoken but always understood. The setting was calm, polished, and timeless, a world where luxury masked secrecy, and that was exactly how he preferred it. It was here that the Russian fixer evolved from legend to myth. He became part of the quiet machinery of influence that spanned borders, currencies, and reputations. Monte Carlo was the perfect crossroads, European elegance on the surface, silent power beneath. Deals that began on the casino floor ended in boardrooms, and conversations that seemed casual shaped the outcomes of global ventures. Tokhtakhounov fit into this environment as if born to it. He didn't need to buy entry, his demeanor opened doors long before his name did. Around this time, the Western press began to take a mild interest in him, though often through curiosity rather than accusation. He was photographed occasionally beside socialites and actors, attending charity events, and mingling at private parties. His charm remained intact, understated, respectful, but unmistakably magnetic. Those who met him described him as intelligent, witty, and impossible to read. He had the rare ability to make everyone feel important while revealing nothing about himself. He continued to move between worlds, Moscow, Paris, Monte Carlo, sometimes even New York. Each city offered a different rhythm, and he adapted with ease. In Moscow, he was the calm in a storm, in Monte Carlo, the gentleman among gamblers, in Paris, the cultured patron, and in New York, a quiet observer of ambition. Wherever he went, rumors followed, about his ties to sports, gambling, and the opaque world of financial mediation. Yet no one could point to a single act that proved anything. He was always present, never implicated. The European elite, particularly in Monaco and France, found him fascinating. Unlike many of the Russian newcomers who flooded the Riviera with loud wealth and bad manners, Tokhtakhounov carried himself with old-world grace. He didn't need to announce himself, he was recognized through whispers. He spoke French fluently, enjoyed art exhibitions, and treated conversation as an art form. To the rich and restless, he was a mystery worth knowing. To the careful observer, he was the quiet architect behind favors exchanged between nations. But beneath the glittering surface, his life remained anchored in the same principles that had always guided him: discretion, connection, and adaptability. He never stayed too long in one place, never attached himself to a single circle. Just as he had in Moscow, he maintained layers of existence. There was the visible man, the socialite, the patron, the friend of athletes and artists. And then there was the invisible one, the mediator, the arranger, the man whose phone number was kept in private notebooks and spoken only when absolutely necessary. Monte Carlo offered him something Moscow could not: stability. There were no street wars here, no chaotic power struggles. Influence operated in subtle currents. He became known among certain circles as a gentleman consultant, someone who could quietly resolve delicate issues, from financial disputes to matters of reputation. He had no office, no business card, but his word carried weight. When problems arose between partners or nations, someone would inevitably say, "Perhaps Alec can help." The irony of it all was that he seemed genuinely at peace. The violence and paranoia that haunted other men of his generation did not follow him here. He walked freely through the Riviera streets, unguarded, nodding politely to acquaintances who weren't sure if he was a businessman or a legend. To him, this was not hiding, it was living. The life he had built was one of quiet motion, like a current beneath the surface of calm water. He spent much of his time with athletes, continuing the lifelong bond he had formed with the world of sports. Football, tennis, and figure skating, these were communities where he felt both nostalgia and opportunity. He attended events, befriended coaches and judges, and became part of the global network that connected sports, sponsorships, and influence. To some, his involvement seemed innocent, an old enthusiast supporting the games he loved. To others, it hinted at something deeper, something unseen. Even so, he carried himself with the same tranquility that had always defined him. He was courteous to journalists, respectful to officials, and never arrogant. He projected an image of the cultured expatriate, a man who had escaped the volatility of Russia to live out his days in quiet luxury. But behind that serenity lay the same invisible machinery that had always followed him, the network, the whispers, the quiet understanding that if something needed to be done, he could make it happen. Monte Carlo was full of people chasing illusions, gamblers, dreamers, washed-up aristocrats. Tokhtakhounov was different. He didn't chase luck, he calculated it. He didn't gamble with money, he gambled with timing. Watching him at a casino table was like watching an actor perform without words, composed, patient, never emotional. Even when he lost, he smiled. Those who observed him closely understood that his real game was never on the table, it was in the room. Every glance, every gesture, every silence was a move in a far more intricate play. As the years passed, his reputation grew more abstract, not just a man of influence, but a symbol of an era when power became fluid, borderless, and quiet. He embodied the post-Soviet transformation, from a world of ideology to a world of transactions. He wasn't a warlord or an oligarch, he was something subtler, the human link between them. Yet, as serene as his life appeared, storms were gathering on the horizon. His name, which had once been a whisper among Russia's elite, was beginning to circulate in Western intelligence reports. The networks he had woven so effortlessly, across sports, entertainment, and finance, were starting to attract attention from people who viewed such smoothness with suspicion. In the near future, the world would see his face on television screens, and his calm life among the Mediterranean winds would be interrupted by headlines. But for now, in this moment of stillness before the storm, he was at the height of his invisible reign. The world knew his name but not his story. The Mediterranean shimmered below his balcony, the evening air heavy with salt and quiet laughter, and somewhere far off, another deal was already beginning to turn, unseen, unspoken, inevitable. Because for Alimzhan Tokhtakhounov, Monte Carlo was not an escape. It was evolution, the next act in the life of a man who had mastered the rarest kind of power, the power to exist without leaving a trace. The year 2002 was supposed to be remembered for the beauty of the Winter Olympics in Salt Lake City, the flawless ice routines, the pure artistry of competition. But instead, it became the year when the name Alimzhan Tokhtakhounov escaped the quiet luxury of Monte Carlo and entered the harsh glare of global headlines. What began as an elegant scandal in sports soon turned into an international hunt for a man the press called the Russian fixer. It started with whispers during the Olympic figure skating competition, subtle complaints from judges, murmurs in corridors, and a sense that something unseen was shaping the results. The pair's event ended in outrage when the French team received gold amid allegations that the Russian pair had been unfairly demoted. Behind the scenes, investigators began hearing a name passed between officials like a secret, a man rumored to have brokered an exchange of favors between Russian and French skating judges. His reward, it was said, would not be money but influence, a gesture of friendship to ensure future opportunities. The world was stunned when the FBI announced an indictment against Tokhtakhounov, accusing him of orchestrating an international scheme to fix the Olympic results. Western headlines painted him as a spider at the center of a web of corruption stretching from Moscow to Monaco. The man who fixed the Olympics, one headline declared, while others called him the invisible hand behind gold. For the first time, the phantom was illuminated. Photographs of Tokhtakhounov began circulating across television networks, the calm, suited figure with soft eyes and a half-smile, looking more like an art dealer than a criminal. To the Western press, he was an enigma, a socialite, a businessman, a suspected underworld negotiator. To those who knew him, it was absurd, a misunderstanding of his character and the world he lived in. But in that moment, truth no longer mattered. The myth had found its global stage. In Monte Carlo, the news spread like wildfire. The same casinos where he had once been welcomed with smiles now whispered his name with fear. Friends became cautious, calls went unanswered, and old acquaintances pretended not to know him. But Tokhtakhounov himself seemed unfazed. When reporters approached him, he denied the accusations calmly, his tone steady, almost amused. "It's nonsense," he said in one interview. "I am not interested in sports politics. I watch skating because it is beautiful." He spoke as if the world had confused him with someone else, as if he were the victim of mistaken identity on an absurdly large scale. Yet beneath his calm exterior, he understood the gravity of what was happening. The United States had taken notice, and once that happened, it rarely let go. The indictment accused him not just of influencing the Olympics but of belonging to a broader network involved in gambling and organized manipulation of sporting events. He was portrayed as a symbol of Russia's growing reach into the institutions of the West, a ghostly influence blurring the lines between money, politics, and sport. Interpol issued alerts. The FBI placed him on a wanted list. But catching a phantom was never going to be easy. He had lived his life precisely to avoid moments like this, never tied to paper trails, never trapped in one place. His wealth was quiet, his allies loyal, and his movements unpredictable. Still, the pressure was real. For the first time, he was being hunted not by rumor, but by governments. In Moscow, the reaction was complicated. To some, the indictment was proof of Western hypocrisy, an attempt to vilify another Russian businessman. To others, it was a warning that the glamorous freedom of the 1990s had come to an end. And in the midst of this, Tokhtakhounov's reputation in Russia paradoxically grew. He became a folk figure of sorts, the man who had outplayed the system, who could be accused by the world's most powerful agencies and still smile. While international investigators tried to build a case, Tokhtakhounov continued to live as if nothing had changed. He was seen dining in Monte Carlo, attending private gatherings, his composure unbroken. But the quiet pressure was mounting, and by summer, the storm would arrive. In July 2002, Italian authorities, acting on an American request, arrested him in his penthouse near Lake Como. The image of his arrest traveled across the world, the Russian fixer, being led through marble corridors by polite but firm Italian officers. For a man who had lived unseen for decades, it was a surreal moment of exposure. Yet even in that instant, he appeared calm, composed, and impeccably dressed. No resistance, no panic, just a faint, knowing smile. His arrest triggered a diplomatic storm. The United States demanded his extradition, insisting that he be tried on American soil. But the case quickly grew tangled in international politics. Italy hesitated, Moscow protested, and legal proceedings stretched on in a blur of bureaucracy and influence. Through it all, Tokhtakhounov maintained his innocence. He told journalists, "I am not a criminal. I have never harmed anyone. These are stories created by people who need a villain." The world's fascination with him deepened. Was he truly guilty, a manipulator who could bend the Olympics itself, or a man caught in the West's hunger for a symbol of Russian corruption? Interviews, documentaries, and speculation multiplied, but none brought clarity. He remained what he had always been, a question no one could answer completely. As the months passed, his image shifted again. The press began to romanticize him, calling him the Phantom of the Riviera, the Gentleman of the Shadows, a modern-day Gatsby lost between luxury and suspicion. Even those who condemned him couldn't ignore the intrigue of his composure. It was as if the scandal, rather than breaking him, had completed his transformation from man to myth. For Tokhtakhounov, the irony was bitterly poetic. He had spent a lifetime mastering invisibility, and now the world could not stop looking at him. Yet even as flashbulbs captured his face, he remained emotionally distant, as if observing the chaos from somewhere far away. To him, the scandal was not a downfall but another phase of the same dance, the delicate game between truth and perception. What no one yet knew was that the Phantom would not only survive this global humiliation but return from it more untouchable than before. The Olympics had made his name infamous, but it also proved that nothing, not even the eyes of the world, could truly pin him down. For a man accused of fixing outcomes, fate seemed to keep fixing itself in his favor. The morning of July 31, 2002, began like any other on the shores of Lake Como. The air was soft and still, the surface of the water gleamed like glass, and the hills beyond were veiled in a gentle Italian haze. Inside one of the region's elegant villas, Alimzhan Tokhtakhounov sat in his living room, sipping espresso, unaware, or perhaps completely aware, that the calm around him was about to shatter. Moments later, the quiet rhythm of his morning was broken by a knock at the door. Italian officers entered the villa, polite but firm, their presence carrying the weight of international law. They addressed him formally, explaining the arrest warrant issued at the request of the United States. The charges, conspiracy, bribery, and involvement in fixing the 2002 Winter Olympics figure skating competition. For a man who had spent decades moving unseen, the irony was sharp. He had been accused of manipulating outcomes on ice, and now, his own life was about to slide into unfamiliar territory. Yet, as they placed him under arrest, Tokhtakhounov remained as composed as ever, polite, cooperative, and even slightly amused. "It's a mistake," he told them, almost softly. But mistakes happen. The scene, though calm, had a cinematic quality to it. The officers, dressed in dark suits, led the silver-haired man out through the villa's marble corridor, past large windows overlooking the lake. Outside, the hum of journalists began to gather, their cameras flashing like sparks. To the world, it was the capture of an international criminal. To those who knew him, it was something more surreal, the public unmasking of a man who had built a life on never being caught in the light. In the days that followed, Tokhtakhounov was moved to Milan, where he awaited extradition hearings. The press swarmed the story, painting him as a mastermind of global corruption, the embodiment of Russian intrigue in the Western imagination. The image was irresistible, a sophisticated man accused of quietly controlling the fates of Olympic athletes, pulling strings across continents, all from behind his impenetrable calm. The media branded him the gentleman fixer, the shadow broker, and the phantom of the games. For once, the myth had a face, and it was smiling faintly from behind glass in an Italian courtroom. Inside the prison, however, the story was different. Tokhtakhounov was treated more like an oddity than a villain. The guards respected his composure, his fellow inmates were curious about the polite, well-dressed Russian who read newspapers and offered cigarettes instead of complaints. Unlike many who had been pulled into international scandals, he showed no anger, no despair. To him, confinement was temporary. He once told a visiting journalist, "A cage is only real if you believe you are in it." His lawyers immediately began contesting the U.S. extradition request, arguing that the charges were politically motivated and lacked credible evidence. They pointed out that the alleged Olympic scheme was based on hearsay, not proof. The case, they said, was built on speculation, a misunderstanding inflated by the West's fascination with Russian underworld mystique. In interviews, Tokhtakhounov echoed that sentiment. "It's a fairy tale," he said calmly. "I am a businessman, not a criminal. They needed a villain, and I was convenient." Meanwhile, the diplomatic tension between Russia, Italy, and the United States began to mount. Moscow made quiet but firm moves behind the scenes, objecting to his extradition. To Russian officials, Tokhtakhounov was one of their own, a symbol of how easily Western systems could weaponize reputation. Some suspected that his arrest was not about sports at all, but about geopolitics, about influence, perception, and control. As weeks turned into months, the hearings continued. In Italy, the legal system moved with deliberate patience. Every argument was examined, every translation double-checked. And through it all, Tokhtakhounov sat in court with the serenity of a man listening to a play he had already seen. He wore dark suits, smiled politely to the judge, and occasionally adjusted his cufflinks as journalists took notes. He did not plead, he conversed. Even under accusation, he remained the same figure he had always been, a man who understood that panic was the enemy of power. Outside the courtroom, the story divided the public. To some, he was a dangerous manipulator who had used charm and money to undermine the purity of global sport. To others, he was a scapegoat, a sophisticated man caught in the machinery of international suspicion. Reporters described his demeanor as disarmingly calm, even gentle. There were no dramatic statements, no denials shouted at cameras. Instead, he answered questions with subtle humor. "They say I fixed the Olympics," he once quipped. "If I had that kind of influence, I would have fixed the weather instead." Back in Russia, he became something of a paradoxical celebrity. Talk shows debated his guilt, newspapers published his photos, and old acquaintances told embellished stories about their encounters with him. His name carried a new mystique, not as a villain, but as a man who had dared to play the world's game and survived the first round. In a strange way, his arrest only amplified the myth he had spent decades cultivating. After nearly a year of legal proceedings, the Italian courts made their decision. The evidence presented by the United States was deemed insufficient, and the request for extradition was denied. The courtroom murmured as the verdict was read, a soft gasp of disbelief from journalists who had already written his downfall. Tokhtakhounov, sitting quietly beside his lawyers, nodded slightly, as though he had expected this all along. When asked for comment outside the court, he replied simply, "I am going home." His release was not triumphant but elegant. No grand statements, no celebrations. He returned briefly to his residence, packed his belongings, and within days was back in Moscow. The world's headlines screamed of failure and frustration: "Fixer walks free, Russia's phantom escapes again." To American prosecutors, it was a humiliation; to his admirers, it was vindication. To Tokhtakhounov, it was simply life returning to its natural balance. He had endured international arrest, imprisonment, and global scandal, and yet, he walked out exactly as he had entered, unbroken, composed, and quietly untouchable. It was as if the entire episode had been another test of his invisibility, one that proved he could survive even the brightest spotlight without burning. For months afterward, he stayed mostly out of public view, avoiding interviews and declining invitations. But those who met him during that time said he appeared more reflective than ever. He had seen how quickly the world could turn a man into a symbol, and he had no interest in playing that role again. His focus was on restoration, not of reputation, but of calm. Still, something had changed. The phantom had been seen. His name, once confined to whispers and handshakes, now echoed in courtrooms and newspapers. He was no longer just a figure of rumor, he was a global enigma, loved, hated, and above all, remembered. In the quiet of his Moscow apartment, he would sometimes sit by the window, watching snow fall softly over the city he had left behind years ago. The streets were colder now, the faces more cautious, but the rhythm was familiar. He was home again, a free man in a country where myths lived longer than truth. The world might have called him a criminal, a manipulator, or a ghost, but in his mind, he was still the same man he had always been, calm, courteous, untouchable. A gentleman behind bars, and now, once again, a phantom in the open. When Alimzhan Tokhtakhounof's plane touched down in Moscow, the world's cameras turned elsewhere, but inside Russia, the air carried a different kind of electricity. He had returned home not as a fugitive or a failure, but as something almost mythic, the man who had outplayed the United States and walked away untouched. For many Russians, his release felt like a symbolic victory, a story that fit perfectly into the growing national mood of defiance toward Western power. Yet, for Tokhtakhounov himself, the return was not about triumph. It was about silence. He arrived quietly, without a media entourage, without a parade of friends waiting at the airport. There were no grand statements, no celebration. He simply disappeared into Moscow's cold evening air, a shadow melting back into the city that had created him. For weeks, no one knew exactly where he was. Journalists speculated, tabloids guessed, and rumor filled the void as it always had. Some said he had retreated to a luxury apartment in Patriarch's Ponds, others that he was staying in the suburbs under discreet protection. But those who truly knew him said nothing. Silence, after all, was his greatest ally. When he eventually reappeared, it was not in a press conference or a courtroom, but at a dinner, a small private gathering attended by familiar faces from Moscow's elite. He looked calm, unhurried, almost indifferent to the noise that had surrounded his name for months. Dressed impeccably as always, he greeted old friends with the same gentle humor that had once made him the center of Moscow's social circles. "I told them I don't belong in prison," he said lightly, but they didn't listen until Italy agreed. The table erupted in laughter. The tension broke. The phantom had returned, and even scandal couldn't touch his composure. But beneath the laughter, there was something deeper at play. His release had elevated him beyond the realm of ordinary men. He was no longer simply Taiwanchik, the well-connected businessman. He was now a symbol, of survival, of mystery, of quiet defiance. Those who dealt with him saw it too. Even the most powerful oligarchs treated him with a new, subtle respect. The man who had walked away from an international arrest warrant with a smile had proven himself untouchable in a way that few in Russia's turbulent hierarchy could claim. The early 2000s in Moscow were years of transformation. The city was cleaner, wealthier, but colder, both literally and emotionally. The reckless freedom of the 1990s had hardened into hierarchy. Power was consolidating. The chaotic oligarchs who once ruled by wealth now bowed to political structures far more disciplined and controlled. In this new environment, discretion wasn't just useful, it was necessary. Tokhtakhounov understood this instinctively. He didn't seek headlines or attention. Instead, he resumed his life with quiet precision, attending select events, maintaining old friendships, and moving through the city like a man immune to time. He gave occasional interviews, always carefully measured. When asked about his arrest, he dismissed it as a misunderstanding. "They wanted a Russian villain," he said, his voice steady and low. "And I fit the image. But I am just a businessman, nothing more." He spoke with the calm of a man who had made peace with being misunderstood. To the Western press, he was a symbol of corruption. To Russians, he was something more nuanced, a figure who embodied the thin line between myth and reality that defined their new era. In those years, Tokhtakhounov began re-establishing his connections across industries, real estate, entertainment, sports, and diplomacy. His name appeared quietly in guest lists at charity events and business functions. Yet no one could point to what he did. He didn't run companies or hold offices, but everyone knew that when negotiations stalled, when disputes turned dangerous, when introductions needed to be made, his presence had a way of smoothing the edges. He was a mediator in a world that no longer trusted its own language. There was something almost ghost-like about the way he moved through society. He appeared and vanished with perfect rhythm. One night, he'd be seen at a fashion gala beside famous actresses, the next, he'd disappear for months, unreachable, unseen. It was this rhythm that protected him. To stay alive in post-Soviet Russia's upper echelons meant knowing when to step forward and when to fade into the background. And Tokhtakhounov, as always, mastered it with quiet grace. The Italian ordeal had changed him, but not outwardly. Those who met him in the years following his return said he had grown more introspective. He spoke less about business and more about philosophy, about fate, about the strange balance of power and destiny. He once told a friend, "In our world, freedom is not the absence of chains. It's knowing which chains you can carry without pain." It was the kind of statement that lingered long after he said it, simple on the surface, profound underneath. Despite the tension that occasionally surrounded his name, he never behaved like a man under threat. He walked the city freely, dined in public, and even appeared in interviews that blended charm with subtle irony. There was a sense that he had transcended fear. He understood that visibility could be controlled, reputation could be shaped, and scandal could be survived, as long as one never lost composure. In private, however, he was said to have grown more careful. His circle shrank. He trusted fewer people. The paranoia that haunted many of his contemporaries seemed absent, but only because he managed it differently. Instead of running from enemies, he dissolved into networks they couldn't penetrate. He didn't need guards because his security was social, woven into the structure of influence itself. Still, there were moments when solitude caught up with him. Friends recalled evenings in his apartment when the conversation would turn quiet, and he'd stare out the window, cigarette in hand, lost in thought. When asked what he was thinking, he would smile faintly and say, "How strange that everything changes, and yet nothing really does." There was melancholy in those words, the fatigue of a man who had lived too long between worlds. Yet even in that stillness, he remained powerful. Journalists tried to reignite the scandal, to dig deeper into his alleged dealings, but nothing stuck. The trail always vanished in fog. His name would resurface every few years, in connection with a rumor, a lawsuit, a mysterious investment, but like clockwork, he would emerge untouched, giving brief denials that only deepened his mystique. By 2004, his return to Moscow's social life was complete. He was seen at exclusive clubs, fashion shows, even sports events, surrounded by familiar faces from decades past. The younger generation of businessmen, who had grown up hearing his name in whispers, now treated him as a living legend, the man who had survived the fall of empires and the scrutiny of nations. To them, he represented the golden rule of power: stay quiet, stay graceful, and never let them see you sweat. He once described his life in a single line that captured everything: "I do not live in the shadows. I live between them." And that was true. He was no longer hiding, he was existing in the spaces between myth and memory, between fame and anonymity. Alimzhan Tokhtakhounov had returned home, not to reclaim the past, but to continue living as he always had, unseen, undefeated, and always one step beyond reach. He had been arrested, accused, and exposed, yet somehow, he emerged even stronger, his legend brighter than ever. The phantom had come home, and Moscow, a city that understood ghosts better than any other, welcomed him back as one of its own. By the mid-2000s, Alimzhan Tokhtakhounov had transformed himself into something more than a man, he had become a network. Not in the digital sense, but in the old-world meaning of the term, a living web of influence, favors, and unspoken understanding stretching quietly across continents. His name no longer belonged to a single city or nation, it was part of the soft architecture of global power, existing where money, sport, and politics blurred into one another. In Moscow, people said he had returned from the dead. In Europe, he was called the gentleman ghost of Monte Carlo. In the United States, his name still lingered in FBI files, a puzzle unsolved, a name that meant too much and too little at the same time. Yet in the midst of that intrigue, Tokhtakhounov carried himself with an almost unnerving calm. He wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He was simply moving, through airports, restaurants, and diplomatic receptions, as though the entire world were one vast, dimly lit ballroom in which he'd long learned how to dance without ever stepping on anyone's toes. His network was not built on intimidation but on necessity. Everyone he knew, from businessmen to politicians to athletes, needed something, a connection, a favor, a signature, a solution. And Tokhtakhounov, with his quiet charm and flawless memory, always knew how to deliver. He was never the loudest man in the room, but always the most remembered. People left meetings with him feeling reassured, believing that things would soon work themselves out. In truth, it was Tokhtakhounov working them out behind the scenes. He didn't control corporations or armies, but he controlled access, the invisible currency of the 21st century. A diplomat in Paris needed an introduction to a businessman in Moscow. Tokhtakhounov could arrange it. A Russian athlete wanted to train abroad without bureaucratic obstacles. He knew the right calls to make. An investor needed his money moved discreetly across borders. Leave it with Alec, they would say. He'll find a way. What fascinated observers most was how intangible his operations were. There was no structure, no office, no chain of command. His power existed entirely in the space between people, in loyalty, gratitude, and the quiet weight of reputation. That made him nearly impossible to trace. Law enforcement agencies in several countries tried to map his dealings, but found themselves chasing shadows. Every lead ended in a whisper, every transaction dissolved into a fog of favors and intermediaries. Western intelligence reports described him as a facilitator for transnational influence, a phrase that meant everything and nothing. They suspected he had ties to gambling syndicates, to sports agencies, to financial networks that operated beyond jurisdiction. But they could never prove anything substantial. Each time his name surfaced, it faded again, like smoke, visible only for a second before dispersing into the air. Yet, even amid that ambiguity, there was an undeniable elegance to how he managed it all. He never seemed hurried or burdened. Those who dined with him said he had a way of making even the most complex conversations feel light. He spoke of art, history, and philosophy with ease. He never mentioned business directly, but the right words always found their way in. Deals that began as idle conversations over coffee would, weeks later, quietly bear fruit. He was a man who did everything without appearing to do anything. By this time, Tokhtakhounov's connections had grown astonishingly broad. He was friendly with oligarchs, yes, but also with artists, former politicians, and international celebrities. The sports world, especially, remained his most enduring domain. Football clubs, tennis tournaments, and boxing promotions, he had friends everywhere. It wasn't about profit anymore, it was about presence. Sports had always fascinated him because they mirrored life, strategy, risk, timing, and grace under pressure. The irony, of course, was that his alleged interference in sports years earlier had made him infamous, yet his love for the games remained genuine. To his friends, he was the same Alec, soft-spoken, kind, occasionally mischievous. He remembered birthdays, sent thoughtful gifts, and never forgot a favor owed. People trusted him not because he demanded it, but because he earned it through consistency. In a world where alliances shifted like sand, Tokhtakhounov represented something rare, stability. But beneath that surface, there was always complexity. His influence, though subtle, made him a target of fascination and envy. Western authorities continued to watch him. His name appeared occasionally in confidential reports and leaked documents linking him to suspected money movements. Yet every attempt to implicate him fell apart. It was as if the evidence refused to stay solid, dissolving like mist whenever light touched it. The very thing that had made him powerful, his fluidity, now made him untouchable. In Moscow, he had become almost legendary. Younger businessmen, those who had grown up hearing stories about the wild 1990s, viewed him as the last survivor of a vanished era, a man who could thrive in both the chaos of the past and the structure of the present. He wasn't nostalgic, he was pragmatic. While others bragged about their connections to the Kremlin or their offshore accounts, Tokhtakhounov kept his tone modest. "Everyone wants to be powerful," he once told a journalist, "but real power is when no one notices you have it." His reputation abroad oscillated between fascination and suspicion. The French saw him as an eccentric bon vivant, the Americans still considered him a symbol of unpunished corruption, and in Italy, where he had once been held, his name was spoken with a mix of respect and disbelief. Somehow, everyone had an opinion about him, yet no one actually knew him. Through it all, he continued to travel freely. He attended events in Monaco, exhibitions in Paris, private gatherings in Istanbul, and discreet business meetings in Moscow. His face, calm and unreadable, began to symbolize something more abstract, the persistence of the old world in a new age dominated by surveillance and exposure. He was living proof that in a time when everyone was being watched, some men could still move unseen. By the late 2000s, technology had begun to erode privacy for everyone, but not for him. He avoided emails, encrypted messages, and anything that left a trace. His communication style remained old-fashioned: personal meetings, handshakes, and unrecorded conversations. It wasn't paranoia, it was principle. He had always believed that trust, once digitized, lost its soul. It was said that Tokhtakhounov kept notebooks, small, elegant journals filled with names, numbers, and small details about people. Birthdays, preferences, debts. Whether this was true or merely part of his legend, no one could confirm. But those who claimed to have seen one described it as meticulous, beautiful in its order, a reflection of the man himself. In truth, the global web he had woven was less about crime than it was about connection. He had become the invisible diplomat of an unspoken world order, where business, culture, and influence overlapped quietly. For every rumor of corruption, there was a story of generosity; for every accusation of manipulation, there was an act of grace. As the world changed, as power became digital and transparency became illusion, Tokhtakhounov remained what he had always been: analog, human, deliberate. A man of gestures instead of contracts, trust instead of documents. The 1990s had belonged to the loud, the 2000s belonged to the silent. And no one embodied that silence better than Alimzhan Tokhtakhounov, a man whose network spanned continents, whose face appeared nowhere, and whose presence could still be felt everywhere. He had lived long enough to understand that the greatest power in the world was not wealth, nor even influence, it was composure. By the late 2000s, after surviving investigations, accusations, and the relentless curiosity of the press, Alimzhan Tokhtakhounov had distilled his life into a single philosophy: a man who remains calm cannot be controlled. His public image, the Russian fixer, the Phantom of Monte Carlo, the gentleman of the underworld, was, to him, little more than a story others needed to tell. The truth, he often implied, was quieter, simpler, and far less glamorous. But the world didn't crave truth, it craved myth. So he let them have it. Those who spent time with him in these years described a man who had become almost meditative. He was neither reclusive nor boastful, just deliberate. Every word, every glance, every pause carried meaning. His laughter was soft, his voice never raised. People came to him not just for help or introductions, but for counsel. He listened like no one else, said one acquaintance. When you spoke, he looked at you as if your problem was the only thing that existed. And then, in one sentence, he would dissolve it. It wasn't charisma in the traditional sense, it was presence. Tokhtakhounov embodied a kind of stillness that made chaos seem manageable. Those who entered his orbit often left calmer than they arrived. Perhaps that was his secret, not manipulation, but mastery of energy, the ability to steady the room simply by being in it. Privately, he often reflected on the rules that had guided him through decades of uncertainty. He once shared them with a friend, almost as if reciting a quiet prayer. Never speak more than necessary, he began. Never owe a man twice. Don't fight battles you can avoid. Don't chase money, it comes to those who make others feel safe. And above all, never forget who you were before they started calling you names. To outsiders, these words might sound like the musings of a philosopher. But to those who knew the undercurrents of Russian life, they were survival codes. In a society where power could vanish overnight, these rules were not poetry, they were armor. He never saw himself as a criminal. In interviews, when journalists prodded him about his alleged connections to organized networks, he smiled with that familiar restraint. "They call it crime," he said once, "but I call it understanding how the world works." It wasn't arrogance, it was conviction born of experience. He believed that systems, whether capitalist or communist, all relied on the same human weaknesses: greed, fear, pride, and desire. To him, morality was situational, what mattered was balance. In his mind, loyalty was the highest virtue. "You can forgive betrayal," he said once, "but you must never forget it." Loyalty, for Tokhtakhounov, was not about blind obedience but about reliability, the knowledge that someone would not turn against you when the wind changed. His inner circle was small but unwavering, composed of people who had known him since his youth. They respected him not because of what he owned, but because of what he understood. He believed in the power of reputation, not the kind that shouted, but the kind that whispered. In his view, a man's true currency was the way others spoke of him when he wasn't in the room. "Money," he said, "is like perfume. Too much of it, and people turn away. But respect, that's the scent you want to leave behind." This was the essence of what some began calling the fixer's philosophy, a collection of principles drawn from his life, though he never wrote them down. For Tokhtakhounov, control was not about dominating others, it was about mastering oneself. He observed how so many powerful men lost everything because they couldn't manage their tempers, their appetites, their need to be seen. He, on the other hand, found peace in restraint. He avoided extravagance not out of modesty, but strategy. While others flaunted their success, he wore his like a secret. He understood that envy was the true weapon of destruction, that every display of wealth invited attention, and attention invited danger. "If they can't measure you," he liked to say, "they can't hurt you." In conversations, he sometimes drifted toward philosophy. He spoke of fate with the same calm he applied to business. "Everything we do," he told one friend, "comes back to us in a different form. You help a man today, and tomorrow someone else will help you. It's not mysticism, it's rhythm." He saw the world as a series of exchanges, a dance of intentions. Even his critics admitted that he seemed to live according to a deeper order, as if he could sense the pattern behind every event. Despite his soft tone, there was steel beneath his calm. When provoked or threatened, he didn't shout, he disappeared. Enemies couldn't fight a man who wasn't there. Those who crossed him rarely faced violence, instead, they found doors quietly closing, phone calls unanswered, opportunities evaporating. His revenge, when it came, was silence. Over the years, his legend began to eclipse the man himself. Young men in Moscow's clubs and cafes spoke of him with reverence, as though he were a character out of folklore, the last true fixer, a master of the invisible art. Books and documentaries referenced him, usually with exaggerated drama, painting him as either a criminal mastermind or a misunderstood genius. He neither denied nor confirmed anything. "A story is a story," he said once with a shrug. "If it helps them sleep, let them tell it." But for those who saw him up close, there was nothing theatrical about him. His power came from patience. He didn't rush outcomes, he allowed them to ripen. He had an almost spiritual faith in timing, that most problems solved themselves if one simply waited long enough. "People ruin good situations by panicking," he said. "The world gives you what you want the moment you stop chasing it." He lived as a man both of this world and beyond it, practical, grounded, yet somehow detached from material obsession. He could appreciate a fine meal, a tailored suit, a glass of aged cognac, but he never seemed owned by any of it. The material was simply a stage for his deeper pursuit, the cultivation of stillness in a world addicted to motion. To those who studied him from afar, Tokhtakhounov appeared almost paradoxical, a man accused of corruption who spoke like a monk, a figure feared by governments but beloved by friends, a ghost who left footprints in marble halls. But perhaps that paradox was the point. He lived by the belief that truth was too fragile to survive exposure. To stay whole, one had to remain partly unseen. By the end of the decade, his philosophy had hardened into instinct. The chaos of the 1990s had faded, the power struggles of the 2000s had stabilized, but Tokhtakhounov remained, untouched, unchanged, and unhurried. His secret wasn't luck or protection. It was perspective. While others played for short-term victories, he had always played the long game, and in that game, patience was king. He once summarized it best in a conversation that later became famous among his acquaintances. "Everyone runs from shadows," he said, lighting a cigarette, "but I learned long ago, the shadow is where the truth hides." And in that single line lay the quiet genius of Alimzhan Tokhtakhounov, a man who built his life not by chasing power, but by mastering the shadows that power leaves behind. By the time the second decade of the 2000s began, a subtle change had crept into the life of Alimzhan Tokhtakhounov. On the surface, everything seemed the same, the quiet grace, the unshakable calm, the soft laughter that lingered like smoke in expensive restaurants. But beneath the calm veneer, the world was shifting again. The men he had once advised or helped had grown older, more ambitious, or more afraid. The new generation that was rising in Russia and beyond was different, less loyal, more reckless, and far more digital. The art of invisibility was becoming obsolete in an era obsessed with exposure. And for the first time in decades, the phantom began to feel the faint chill of unease. He had always believed that discretion was protection, but now, the world was running on transparency, a dangerous illusion where everything could be recorded, traced, and replayed. Cameras were everywhere, voices were being captured, and secrets were stored not in minds but on servers. For a man who had built his legend on silence, this was not progress, it was intrusion. The old rules that had kept him alive were beginning to erode, replaced by algorithms and surveillance he could not charm. He still moved with confidence, but there was a new kind of awareness in his eyes, not fear, but vigilance sharpened by years of survival. At first, he tried to ignore it. He told himself that paranoia was for men who had something to lose. And yet, each year, the circle around him grew smaller. Some old friends had died, others had disappeared, and the new faces that entered his orbit seemed louder, hungrier, and less predictable. He noticed how conversations changed, less trust, more caution. People recorded meetings, for safety. Text messages replaced handshakes. The intimacy that once defined his world was being replaced by documentation. It was a transformation he neither trusted nor liked. Still, outwardly, he remained composed. He attended gatherings in Moscow, Monte Carlo, and Paris, smiling for the cameras when necessary, but always fading to the background when attention grew too heavy. His charm had not faded, if anything, time had refined it. Yet the joy seemed to have dulled. The laughter was more polite now, the gestures slower, the nights quieter. He wasn't retreating, he was observing. Watching the world he once mastered begin to forget its own rhythm. It was around this time that whispers of danger began to surface again. Not direct threats, but currents, investigations revived, journalists revisiting his past, new financial laws probing the global elite. The old accusations returned in fresh packaging: money laundering, gambling, influence peddling. None of it new, none of it proven, yet each report added a layer to the shadow following him. Even those closest to him began to advise caution. "Things are different now, Alec," one old friend told him. "People don't disappear quietly anymore. They trend." Tokhtakhounov smiled at the irony but took the warning to heart. In private, however, something deeper was stirring. Years of calculated calm had left him without obvious enemies, but they had also left him without true allies. The world of favors had grown transactional, loyalty replaced by convenience. He had lived long enough to see the currency of trust devalue. When he looked at the younger generation, the billionaires posting photos of their yachts, the politicians flaunting their power online, he saw a kind of madness. They mistake attention for respect, he said once quietly. But attention is only the promise of being forgotten faster. Despite this disillusionment, he remained a man of ritual. His mornings were slow, filled with reading and reflection. He still smoked the same brand of cigarettes, still listened to classical music as he worked through calls and quiet meetings. He didn't live in fear, he lived in awareness. He knew the price of his reputation, that the higher one's myth rose, the longer its shadow stretched. And sometimes, he felt that shadow move before he did. There were moments, rare but unmistakable, when unease broke through his composure. Once, at a late-night gathering in a private Moscow club, someone mentioned an investigation in the West that named him again. The table went silent, all eyes turning to him. He smiled faintly, exhaled smoke, and said, "Let them chase ghosts." The laughter returned, but for the first time, there was an edge beneath it, the laughter of men who understood that even ghosts can be cornered in the modern world. He began changing routines, though he pretended not to. He traveled less frequently, used new phones, and preferred in-person meetings to digital ones. He trusted his instincts more than ever, and they often told him that the quiet around him was not peace but pressure. He never expressed it openly, but there were signs, longer silences during conversations, more time spent alone, fewer appearances at public events. It wasn't retreat, it was self-preservation. The man who once walked effortlessly between shadows was learning that even shadows had grown thinner. Yet, paradoxically, this growing isolation gave his legend new strength. The less people saw of him, the more they speculated. "He's gone underground," some said. "He's retired," claimed others. A few whispered that he was orchestrating things quietly from behind the scenes, influencing outcomes with the same invisible precision as before. In truth, perhaps he was doing all of it, or none. That was his power, the uncertainty. The myth of his control was often more effective than control itself. At home, Tokhtakhounov became increasingly introspective. He had begun writing, not a memoir, but fragments, reflections, and phrases scribbled on pages like quiet confessions. He wrote about loyalty, memory, and the strange loneliness of survival. One line, found years later by a journalist, captured his essence: "When you outlive your enemies, you also outlive your illusions." For a man who had navigated power his entire life, paranoia was not madness, it was discipline. He didn't fear the police, nor the press, nor even betrayal, he feared irrelevance. To vanish completely would mean surrendering the identity that had, for decades, defined him. And yet, to stay visible was to invite risk. He existed in the narrow space between those two extremes, not quite hidden, not quite exposed, suspended in a state of graceful vigilance. In conversation, he spoke more about destiny than strategy now. "Everyone pays," he said once, "but not everyone knows what for." He didn't mean money or crime, he meant life itself, the quiet toll of existing between truth and legend. He had built an empire of whispers, and whispers, in the end, are carried by the wind. Even in his unease, however, there was a sense of peace. He accepted the shifting world for what it was, faster, louder, more reckless, and simply adapted, as he always had. His paranoia was not panic, it was preparation. His caution was not fear, it was the quiet instinct of a man who knew that every empire, even one made of smoke, eventually faces the wind. At night, sitting in his dimly lit apartment, he would watch the lights of Moscow flicker across the skyline. The city had changed beyond recognition, steel towers now stood where his old haunts once were. But to him, the rhythm was the same: ambition, betrayal, survival. He had simply learned to watch it from a safer distance. In those quiet moments, surrounded by silence and the faint hum of the city, Tokhtakhounov was no longer the legend or the fixer. He was just a man, one who had seen too much, trusted too little, and learned that the higher you climb above the noise, the more the silence begins to whisper back. The Americans had long memories. Though years had passed since the scandal of the 2002 Winter Olympics, Alimzhan Tokhtakhounof's name never truly disappeared from their files. In Washington, his story was retold in classified briefings and obscure reports, a lingering reminder of a world the United States could not fully touch, a network of men who thrived in ambiguity, where borders were just lines and influence was traded like currency. To them, Tokhtakhounov represented something larger than himself, the untouchable face of Russian intrigue, the ghost in the global machine. In Moscow, the notion almost amused him. He had lived freely for years, giving interviews, attending public events, and appearing on television, while across the ocean, his name remained etched on lists of wanted men. When asked about it, he would smile and say, "America needs its villains. It's good for their stories." His tone was light, but behind it lay an understanding of something deeper, that once the United States marked a man as an enemy, he remained one forever. The Western pursuit was quiet but constant. The FBI maintained its interest, prosecutors revisited old evidence, journalists occasionally tried to rekindle the narrative. Each time, the accusations were the same, that Tokhtakhounov had ties to gambling rings, that he had facilitated illegal activities between Russia and the West, that he had somehow woven himself into the unseen fabric of organized influence that stretched from Moscow to New York. The charges varied, but the pattern never changed: suspicion without proof, theory without closure. In truth, by this time, he had become more symbol than suspect. The United States had moved on to bigger enemies and newer wars, but Tokhtakhounov lingered like a ghost of a bygone era, the last vestige of the glamorous underworld that had risen from the ashes of the Cold War. Yet, for all the attention, no hand reached out to grab him again. He was free, but freedom came with the awareness that somewhere, someone still whispered his name into official reports. He spoke about it only rarely, usually over late-night drinks with close friends. "They will never stop," he said once, his voice calm but weighted. "It's not personal. It's a system. When they cannot control a man, they chase him. It makes them feel powerful." Then, after a pause, he added, "But power without proximity is an illusion. They can write my name on every list, it changes nothing." For him, the Western pursuit was no longer a threat, it was a form of immortality. The FBI's obsession with him was proof of his endurance, a validation that he had survived history itself. Others who had shared his world were gone, exiled, or forgotten. Yet his name remained alive, circling the headlines every few years, resurrected by journalists who couldn't resist the allure of the phantom who never faded. Still, the attention carried weight. He could never travel freely to certain countries again. Every flight had to be considered, every border crossing measured. In Monte Carlo or Paris, he was welcome, even respected. But the United States was forbidden territory, a line he would never cross. And while he rarely admitted it, that invisible boundary sometimes stung. He was a man who had walked among presidents and princes, yet there were places in the world where his existence had been reduced to a red notice and a dossier. His life in Moscow became both comfortable and confined. He still lived elegantly, dinners in private restaurants, summers abroad, quiet weekends by the sea. Yet there was always a sense that the world had narrowed. Every so often, a new investigation or article would surface, reviving the old accusations under a new headline. Some claimed he was behind new money laundering operations, others linked him to gambling rings in the United States. The pattern was predictable, and his reaction was always the same, a small, amused smile. "They never get tired of telling the same story," he would say, shaking his head. There were moments, though, when the weight of that story pressed harder. Once, during an interview, a reporter asked him if he ever feared extradition or prosecution. He paused before answering. "No," he said finally. "But I have learned that innocence is not freedom. You can be innocent and still live inside someone's story." The interviewer didn't understand at first. But those words revealed more than he intended. For all his composure, Tokhtakhounov knew what it was to live under a shadow cast by others, a shadow that followed him even when the sun had long moved on. The Russian government occasionally intervened on his behalf, denying claims, defending his legitimacy. Whether out of loyalty, politics, or quiet convenience, it didn't matter. The result was the same: protection through ambiguity. In return, he remained discreet. He avoided speaking publicly about the Kremlin or foreign affairs, never aligning himself too closely with anyone in power. He understood that visibility invited risk. The phantom survived because he belonged to no one. As years passed, the distance between him and his Western pursuers became both literal and symbolic. America's attention shifted toward new conflicts, new enemies, and new scandals. But his name would still surface occasionally, a reminder of the old days when the West feared the elegance of Russian power as much as its violence. His story became a myth told in intelligence briefings and crime documentaries, each retelling blurring the line between fact and fantasy. What few noticed was that Tokhtakhounov himself had grown weary of the myth. He no longer cared for the chase, nor for the reputation it sustained. "Let them look," he said one evening to a friend. "It keeps them busy." Then he smiled, that small, knowing smile that had carried him through decades of storms. "Besides, I was never where they thought I was." Yet behind that smile was an understanding that even ghosts grow tired. The endless scrutiny, the persistent suspicion, it wasn't fear that bothered him, but futility. He had built a life out of balance, of silence, of controlled illusion. But how long could one remain the phantom before the world demanded a final act? In the quiet of his Moscow apartment, he sometimes reflected on the irony. The United States had spent years chasing him, building cases that evaporated in the light. Yet, in their pursuit, they had given him something no one else could: permanence. The more they tried to erase him, the deeper his name etched itself into history. He once told a confidant, "They think they're hunting me, but they are preserving me. Every accusation is another chapter they cannot close." It was the most honest truth he had ever spoken. And so the chase continued, slow, symbolic, eternal. The Americans would never forget him, and he would never give them the satisfaction of capture. Theirs was not a battle of law and crime anymore, but of patience and myth. He had survived communism, capitalism, exile, and scandal. The last challenge that remained was time itself. Yet, even in that slow pursuit, Tokhtakhounov found poetry. "It is good," he once murmured, "to be remembered by your enemies. It means you lived well." And perhaps he had. After all, while the world changed and generations passed, one thing remained constant: the phantom was still at large, smiling somewhere behind the smoke. By the early 2010s, the legend of Alimzhan Tokhtakhounov had settled into an almost surreal rhythm. He had lived through revolutions, indictments, and investigations, and yet here he was, walking freely through the gilded streets of Moscow, dining at the finest restaurants, appearing at cultural events, and occasionally granting interviews that only deepened the mystery around him. To the outside world, he was an enigma; to those inside Russia, he was something rarer, a symbol of endurance. The man who had once been hunted by the world's most powerful governments was now living openly in the very city that had birthed him. It was as if Moscow itself had accepted him back into its bloodstream. His name was whispered with a strange mix of respect and fascination. He wasn't seen as a fugitive or a criminal anymore; he was viewed as a survivor, a man who had outlasted everyone who tried to define him. To some, he was a cautionary tale; to others, an icon of quiet defiance. Either way, he had achieved something very few men of his kind ever did: he had become untouchable, not through force, but through presence. He lived comfortably, but never ostentatiously. His apartment, located in one of Moscow's most exclusive neighborhoods, was elegantly understated: soft lighting, walls lined with art, and the faint scent of expensive cigars. Those who visited described it as less a home and more a sanctuary. The decor reflected his personality: measured, calm, quietly luxurious. His days began slowly. A cup of tea or espresso at the same hour every morning, newspapers spread across the table, his reading glasses perched low as he scanned headlines that often mentioned him without truly understanding him. He maintained a disciplined routine, walks through the city, visits to art galleries, dinners with a small circle of trusted friends. Though surrounded by opulence, he lived as if detached from it. The chaos of the 1990s had given way to a colder, more controlled Moscow, but Tokhtakhounov adapted seamlessly. He knew which conversations to avoid, which doors to stay behind, and which friendships to keep at arm's length. Despite his reputation, he was never alone. His social circle remained eclectic: athletes, artists, old friends from the Soviet era, and even a few journalists who admired his poise. To younger Russians, he was a living myth, the man who had faced the full might of the Western world and returned home without a scratch. They treated him with curiosity and reverence, though he found both amusing. "I'm not a hero," he would say with a smirk. "I'm just someone who didn't panic." Publicly, he appeared calm and content. Privately, there was an undercurrent of weariness. He had built his life around control, and control required constant vigilance. He had no official enemies, but his name still lingered in international databases, and every so often, a new story would emerge, a recycled article, a fresh investigation, a new set of rumors. The topics varied: illegal gambling, influence networks, ties to Hollywood, but the pattern was always the same: accusation without resolution. He had grown used to it, even bored by it. "They write about me when they run out of ideas," he told one interviewer, his tone almost affectionate. Yet behind that humor, there was something deeper, an understanding that even legends live in exile, even when they are home. His freedom in Moscow was real, but it was also defined by boundaries. He could travel across Russia, attend public events, even give television interviews, but the rest of the world remained closed. The United States still had him on a wanted list, and several Western nations quietly followed suit. He was a free man, yes, but one with invisible borders. There were moments when the contrast between his outer elegance and inner solitude became stark. Late at night, friends said, he often sat alone by his window, watching the Moscow skyline shimmer under the snow. The city he had conquered had changed, it no longer belonged to his generation. The new elite spoke a different language, not of honor or discretion, but of influence measured in followers and digital reach. For a man whose power was built on silence, this was alien terrain. "Now," he said once quietly, "people want to be seen more than they want to exist." He wasn't bitter, only observant. Time had taught him acceptance, of change, of fading relevance, of mortality. Still, he remained active in his own quiet way. He invested discreetly in projects, art exhibitions, cultural initiatives, and sports organizations. Sometimes his name appeared in connection with them, sometimes not. He preferred it that way. To be everywhere and nowhere, that was his comfort. One of his closest friends once remarked that Tokhtakhounov lived as if he were always preparing for something, even when there was nothing left to prepare for. "He doesn't know how to rest," the friend said. "He's too used to expecting the next move." Indeed, he still kept to his routines of security, changing phone numbers, using drivers he trusted, checking schedules twice before agreeing to meetings. It wasn't paranoia, but muscle memory. A lifetime of survival had become habit. Still, there were glimmers of humanity that pierced through the armor. He loved animals, especially dogs, and was known to feed strays near his building. He was kind to waiters, always tipping generously, and patient with people who sought his attention. Those small gestures revealed the paradox of his life, a man accused of global crimes who lived with quiet gentleness. "You can tell everything about a man," he once said, "by how he treats those who cannot help him." By now, he was in his 60s, still sharp, still elegant, but slower in movement. His voice had deepened, his hair silvered, but his composure never wavered. When he appeared on Russian television, speaking about culture or sports, his tone was thoughtful, deliberate. He spoke not like a criminal, but like a philosopher who had seen the world's illusions and found them amusing. When interviewers tried to corner him with questions about his past, he smiled faintly and said, "That was another time. I am not that man anymore." But of course, everyone knew he was, only quieter, wiser, more ghost than ever. He had become a relic of an age that no longer existed, a time when power was personal, when a handshake meant more than a contract, when the world ran on favors, not algorithms. He didn't resist change, he simply stood apart from it, like a monument that refused to crumble. Yet, for all his detachment, one could sense a hint of melancholy in his solitude. Many of the men he had known were gone, some dead, others imprisoned or exiled. The great empires of money and influence that had once defined the 1990s were now regulated, sanitized, and digitized. The game had changed, and Tokhtakhounov, though still respected, no longer played. He had become the observer, the last gentleman of a vanishing breed. When asked once if he ever regretted anything, he paused for a long time before answering. "No," he said finally. "Everything that happened was supposed to happen. If I had not lived as I did, I would not understand what peace feels like." The interviewer smiled, not realizing the depth of the words. For all his controversies, for all the stories told and retold, Tokhtakhounov had achieved the rarest kind of victory, survival without bitterness. He had lived through chaos and come out intact. His life was not clean, but it was complete. And in the quiet rhythm of Moscow's endless winters, the man once hunted by the world walked its streets freely, the ghost of an old empire moving among the living. He had become what few ever managed to be, a living legend who no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. A man whose very existence blurred the line between guilt and grace. A phantom, yes, but a content one. By the mid-2010s, Alimzhan Tokhtakhounov had entered the final, most paradoxical stage of his life, a man both everywhere and nowhere, visible to all yet untouchable by anyone. In the heart of Moscow, he lived openly, gave interviews, attended elegant soirees, and even appeared on television from time to time. He was no longer the invisible figure operating between nations. Instead, he had become something stranger, a legend living in plain sight. Despite the decades of scandal, accusation, and mythology that trailed his name, Tokhtakhounov appeared entirely at ease. He walked Moscow's winter streets without guards, his scarf neatly folded, his pace unhurried. To the city's new elite, bankers, politicians, media moguls, he was a relic of a different age, the last gentleman of the shadows. The men who ruled the new Russia did so with contracts and screens, Tokhtakhounov had ruled with silence and trust. He was older now, though age seemed to have refined rather than diminished him. His voice carried the patience of experience, his eyes a quiet sharpness that never dulled. In conversation, he spoke of the world as if it were a chessboard, forever rearranging itself but never changing its rules. "The players come and go," he said once, "but the game stays the same." His days followed a ritualized calm. Mornings began with black tea and newspapers spread across his dining table. He read slowly, marking pages with a fountain pen, circling the occasional mention of his name, usually in articles recycling old accusations or speculating on his mysterious influence. He never appeared irritated. If anything, he found it entertaining. "They don't understand," he said once to a friend, "that a lie repeated often enough becomes history. And history is more useful than truth." In the afternoons, he took walks along the boulevards or visited private art galleries, greeting old acquaintances with the same composed charm. He was treated with a blend of respect and fascination, not quite feared, but never underestimated. When asked about the constant rumors that surrounded him, he would shrug softly and say, "Rumors are safer than proof. They keep people interested, but they don't get you arrested." In public, he was composed; in private, he was contemplative. Time had thinned his circle. Many of his contemporaries had vanished into exile, prison, or graves. The few who remained often came to him for advice, seeking his perspective on a world that had become noisier and faster than ever. He listened patiently, offered small suggestions, then sent them away with a smile that said more than words could. But behind that gentle demeanor was the weight of solitude. The further he drifted from his past, the lonelier his survival became. He had no wife, no children, no heir to inherit his peculiar empire of silence. He had friendships, yes, but they were fleeting, maintained through dinners, phone calls, or the occasional shared memory. Those who met him in those years often described a strange duality, a man surrounded by people yet completely alone. He had lived too long among masks to fully remove his own. Even in moments of vulnerability, his composure remained intact. One acquaintance recalled visiting him late one evening. The lights were low, the air heavy with the scent of tobacco and piano music playing faintly in the background. Tokhtakhounov sat by the window, staring out at the quiet city below. "You know," he said softly, "when you are young, you think surviving is victory. But when you get older, you realize survival is just a different kind of solitude." That was the truth of his later years, not tragedy, but reflection. The man who had once controlled outcomes across continents now lived in a single apartment, his influence replaced by memory. Yet there was dignity in it. He didn't chase relevance. He let time carry him, unresisting, as if every day were simply another turn of an old song he already knew by heart. He continued to host small gatherings, intimate dinners filled with laughter, nostalgia, and stories that trailed off before their endings. His guests ranged from old athletes and musicians to younger businessmen who treated him with quiet awe. They asked about the old days, the scandals, the politics. He would smile faintly and say, "The past is a rumor I've stopped correcting." Then he would pour another drink, change the subject, and talk instead about literature, music, or philosophy. Women had always been drawn to him, not for wealth or fame, but for that impossible combination of danger and calm. In his later years, this didn't change. He was attentive but never possessive, affectionate but never bound. "I love beauty," he said once, "but I do not own it. I just let it pass through my life like a song." There was a tenderness in him that few expected, and fewer saw. Beneath the legend, he was still human, capable of warmth, laughter, and quiet melancholy. Still, the loneliness persisted. Those close to him said that as the years passed, he became gentler, even wistful. He spoke more about his youth, about football, about Tashkent and the smell of hot summer nights when he was still unknown. He missed that anonymity, not because it was safe, but because it was honest. Fame, he often said, had turned him into a ghost long before age did. In one of his last known interviews, he said something that lingered in the minds of those who heard it: "I am not hiding. I just live quietly. The world likes noise, I prefer peace. If that makes me invisible, so be it." The interviewer described how, afterward, he sat in silence for several minutes, smoking slowly, his expression unreadable, somewhere between serenity and sorrow. Even as his health began to decline, he refused to show weakness. He remained elegantly dressed, his manners intact, his humor dry. Friends noticed that he moved more slowly, that his once sharp gaze sometimes drifted into memory. But he never complained. "Time," he said, "is the only opponent you can't negotiate with. You just have to play until it wins." By this point, Tokhtakhounov had transcended the categories that had once defined him: criminal, businessman, diplomat, legend. He was simply Alec, a man who had seen empires rise and fall, who had played the long game and survived every hand. The journalists still wrote about him occasionally, trying to rekindle his mystery. But for those who knew him personally, the real mystery was how a man who had lived so much could remain so calm, untouched by bitterness, almost grateful for the quiet. In the end, his life had become a paradox of abundance and emptiness. He had friends, wealth, and freedom, yet his truest companions were memory and reflection. Still, there was peace in that solitude. "I have outlived the noise," he once said. Now I can finally hear myself think. The fixer, the phantom, the man who once shaped destinies with whispers, now lived among his own echoes. And perhaps, in that stillness, he had finally found the one thing he had never been able to arrange for himself: peace. By the 2020s, the world had changed beyond recognition. The chaos and charm of the old Moscow underworld had been replaced by digital empires and glowing screens. Power no longer moved through whispers and handshakes but through networks, data, and algorithms. Men didn't meet in dimly lit restaurants anymore, they met in encrypted chat rooms and cloud servers. But Alimzhan Tokhtakhounov, older now and quietly reflective, watched it all with faint amusement. He saw a world that spoke too loudly, moved too fast, and mistook exposure for strength. The art of invisibility, the skill that had once kept him alive, had become obsolete in an age obsessed with being seen. They confuse attention with influence, he said once softly. But attention burns out. Influence lasts. He had lived his life in the margins between silence and rumor, and now he observed a world that had forgotten what either meant. The new titans of wealth flaunted their fortunes online. Every secret became a post, every connection a headline. For Tokhtakhounov, this was chaos disguised as order. He didn't fear the change, he simply didn't belong to it. His days had grown simple. Mornings with tea and newspapers, afternoons spent walking through Moscow's older neighborhoods where the past still lingered in the stones. He avoided technology as though it carried poison. No smartphones, no social media, no digital traces. He preferred conversation over messages, presence over pixels. The more convenient life becomes, he once told a friend, the more dangerous it gets. He had become an observer, not of crime or politics anymore, but of humanity itself. He watched how people traded privacy for validation, how truth lost its meaning in the storm of constant noise. They've replaced mystery with content, he said with a half smile. But mystery was the only thing that ever made us interesting. Though his name occasionally resurfaced in Western reports or recycled rumors, he no longer cared. The myth had long since outgrown the man. He was content to let others write the stories, journalists, filmmakers, novelists, each adding their own version of him to the archive of legend. They can tell it however they want, he said once, amused. The lie is often kinder than the truth. The few who still visited him in these years described a man at peace, living slowly, elegantly. He would pour tea, listen more than he spoke, and occasionally offer a line of quiet wisdom. He didn't give advice, he revealed perspective. The world hasn't changed, he said once. Only the tools have. People still chase the same illusions, just faster. He spent his evenings listening to classical music, his apartment lit by warm lamps, the outside world reduced to a distant hum. The life that had once moved through danger and diplomacy had narrowed into a tranquil rhythm. He had made peace with solitude. His survival had become his sanctuary. There was no bitterness in him, only reflection. He had seen power shift from guns to gold, and from gold to data, and through it all, he had remained the same, still, silent, patient. Power always changes shape, he said. But fear never does. By then, Tokhtakhounov was no longer a figure of suspicion or scandal. He had become something gentler, a symbol of endurance in a world that had forgotten how to pause. The digital age had replaced his world of shadows, but his legacy lingered like smoke, calm, elusive, impossible to contain. And though history would remember louder men, faster men, and richer men, none would carry the same quiet grace. Alimzhan Tokhtakhounov had learned what the modern world never would, that sometimes, the most powerful act is to step back and let the noise fade away. He vanished the way he lived, quietly, elegantly, without permission or farewell. There was no final interview, no dramatic fall, no headline. One day, Alimzhan Tokhtakhounov was simply gone. His number stopped working, his favorite cafes stopped expecting him, and his seat at private dinners stayed empty. Rumors filled the silence. Some said he had retired to the countryside, others swore he had gone abroad under another name. But those who truly knew him understood, disappearance wasn't escape, it was his final act of control. He had spent a lifetime mastering invisibility, and now he had perfected it. No one saw a funeral, no obituary appeared, no grave was confirmed. And yet, he was everywhere, in old photographs, in the half-told stories of men who once called him for favors, in the quiet admiration of those who envied his poise. Even absence became part of his legend. He had always said that survival was not about outlasting danger, but outlasting memory. When they forget your details, he once murmured, you finally become free. Perhaps that was the truth of his ending, not death, but freedom from being defined. The phantom who had moved through empires and eras left behind only silence, deliberate, polished, final. Those who whisper his name now do so with a smile, unsure whether they are speaking of a man who lived, or a myth who never quite existed. Because Alimzhan Tokhtakhounov didn't die. He simply stopped being seen. Time turned his name into something softer, a legend retold in hushed tones, a myth mistaken for memory. In Moscow's dim lounges and Monte Carlo's faded casinos, they still speak of him, the gentleman who moved like smoke and left no trace behind. His story no longer belongs to courts or newspapers, it belongs to history's half-light. A man who never chased fame, yet became immortal by refusing to be understood. For every accusation, there remains an equal measure of awe. For every rumor, a trace of respect. He proved that power could be graceful, that silence could command more fear than noise. He lived without spectacle and ended without closure, teaching, perhaps unintentionally, that mystery itself can be a legacy. In a world that celebrates noise, he showed that stillness can echo longer. Those who remember him say he taught one quiet truth, that control is not about dominance, but disappearance. The secret, he once said, is to move so quietly that even time forgets to notice. Now, his story drifts like the smoke he once exhaled over a glass of cognac, faint, elusive, and strangely beautiful. Whether he died or simply walked away no longer matters. What matters is the calm after his presence, the space he left behind, that elegant, eternal silence. And in that silence, the phantom still lingers.